Hello and welcome to episode 444 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How you doing?
Well, it's good to be back in the new year, 2024. So I'm absolutely buzzing about the new year at Money to the Masses. I'm excited about the things we're going to be doing. I think there's a lot to look forward to. And there's always, when you have a new year, you always got that new me kind of vibe when it comes to money. And it's also the peak of when people look for personal finance help. So we see it in everything we do: traffic levels, engagement, podcasts, listeners, everything. So it's a real buzz when you come back in the new year at Money to the Masses.
And funny you should mention about new listeners. I was looking at the stats today and I can see that we've picked up some new listeners. So welcome to you. New listeners, you may well want to look at our last two episodes because we made it quite easy for you to find our best bits from 2023. And obviously we did the investment outlook for 2024 in our last episode as well. So there's lots of stuff that you can catch up on the last two episodes, but we'll be bringing you more in this new year.
Yeah, and also in that episode, we did talk about how you could get the most out of Money to the Masses, because there are lots of things we do besides the podcast. So I know listeners probably just focus on the podcast, but we do so much other content on YouTube, on social channels, on the website, that the podcast is just really a small part of what we do. So we will be recording the podcast more and more in 2024. Now, we have been in the past and put some of them up, but we're going to do more of it and probably get to the point where the whole show will be on. So you can see us in the studio, relaxed, reading our notes, however we do it. You'll be able to see behind the curtain, which I quite like. I like people to see how it's done.
Yeah, and to let you in a little further behind the curtain on why we haven't necessarily done that up until now, it's because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I hate things going out that aren't edited to the nth degree. So I'm going to have to learn a new way of just relaxing.
It's a New Year's resolution for you, Andy, to let things go a bit. So on that note, I think it's quite good to tell people what's on the show. Now, there is a link to New Year's resolutions. I'm not one for necessarily creating New Year's resolutions. I think they are almost doomed to failure. And interestingly, over the Christmas period, I was actually asked by a national newspaper for some tips for people in the new year, and something a little bit different. And actually, I didn't get back to them, unfortunately, because I was celebrating Christmas. It was actually Boxing Day at the time. But on that theme, I wanted to give people something to work with. So I don't want people necessarily going out there and creating these New Year resolutions to be fab with money or to do certain things, because I think people are more likely to fail. So I'm going to do something slightly different in that regard to help people hopefully create better money habits. The next piece we want to talk about is to do with side hustles. So there has been a new rule, so new rules that have come in relating to the taxation of side hustles. So when I say the word side hustle, it's people who have another means of generating income outside of, say, their normal employment. And there have been headlines suggesting that everybody's about to get taxed heavily. That's not the case, but I want to tell people what the change is and what they should be looking out for. The final piece, Andy, is going to be a useful one for people going into 2024.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the key dates in 2024 for your personal finances. So throughout the year, there are certain dates, things like the interest rate announcements, things like base rate announcements, but also things about tax, everything you need to know from January through to December. We're going to cover the main points, but we'll also direct listeners to the article that we've written so that they can see all of the dates throughout the calendar year. And actually, I've also included a few extra tips for people to do more with their personal finances.
Great. So let's kick off with the first piece. So as I said, I'm not saying to people do New Year's resolutions, because I think that most people will end up failing them. If it's anything like me, you'll create a New Year's resolution and then find it hard to stick to. Your homework is to go and listen to podcast episode 393. So I listened back to that show before we came on air, and it was one where I talked about building positive habits and how to do that, good money habits. And the episode was inspired by a book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and I talked through how you start to make good habits and how I do it. So the book was almost inspiration for the episode, and I do do touch on bits and pieces from the book as well, and how it actually reinforces some of the things I've done to be able to become good with money over time. And like I said, go back and listen to the episode, but just to give you some highlights, if you want to build good money habits, so we're in a new year, rather than making a resolution that you're going to do something, it's better to try and make changes so you start to be consistent, make good habits that you will keep into the future, not just in the new year, but for hopefully the rest of your life. So some of the tips that are in making good habits is you need to make them obvious. So if you want to start eating better, then you put a bowl of fruit on somewhere that you see regularly, so people talk about on their dining room table, so you're more likely to eat fruit if it's there. So that's about making a good habit when you're eating healthily.
And maybe at the same time remove those Christmas chocolates off of the table.
So you have just hit upon what happens. You create friction for bad habits, so you do the opposite, so you make it less likely that you will do a bad habit. Like I said, I'm just giving you a few highlights. You make the habit that you want to create be attractive, and that could be by something called habit stacking, where you might associate something that you need to do with something that you want to do. So let's say you are wanting to get on top of your money, check your finances. If you do that in the morning like I do when I've had my cup of coffee, the positive is the cup of coffee that I have, but I actually start looking at my finances and budgeting apps first thing in the morning because it's associated with it. So my morning coffee is a habit I have that is never going to change, one I love, but I associate something I need to do, which is to be able to do something very small, very quick, just check the budgeting apps that are automated, what's going on there, and that therefore gives you a positive habit. If you make it easy, so it's again reduce the friction of something happening, so you do things perhaps in small chunks, is more likely to happen. An example I talk about in that podcast episode is that rather than going to the gym and thinking I've got to do a great workout that every time you go, you start going to the gym and you only do a 2-minute workout, which seems quite extreme, but actually what you do is you create a habit which becomes going to the gym rather than the exercise, and in time while you're at the gym you'll start wanting to exercise for longer than 2 minutes. So by doing small incremental changes, that is the difference. So the final thing is you want to make it satisfying. So if you do a good habit, you might get a reward afterwards of some kind. So there is a lot more detail in that episode, like I said, but the real thing is you want to focus on a system rather than the goal. So you want to become good at money, you want to create some kind of system to become better. So the problem with a resolution, you say I want to do this, that's the resolution, I'm going to do something, that's the goal,
and it's normally like a really out there, almost unachievable goal, isn't it? It's a massive thing that becomes almost
exactly, and that's
too
the
big.
thing, it's the mountain that you feel that you'll never be able to climb, the Everest, where you want to do small steps along that journey. So you want to try and change things, and one of the things, it's an idea that some people may have heard about, and again in the book James Clear made, there is this idea that I touched upon for like seconds in that episode about making incremental differences of 1% to improve yourself, but I think it's something that we need to do a bit more on. So what I want to do in this episode is talk more about making the incremental differences. So when you're looking at your finances in this new year, instead of thinking I'm going to do some big project to make myself better, instead try and change one thing a day. And it could be you decide to change one thing a week, but the commitment to doing it consistently, and the idea of trying to change 1%, become 1% better at something. Now, that is more measurable if you're like an Olympic athlete and you're trying to become 1% quicker, like to try and knock small incremental 1% off your time or something like that. That's measurable. The problem with personal finance, lots of things you do aren't actually that measurable. But what I want people to do is take that principle, apply it where they can, but maybe instead try and do one thing. So one thing you could do is each day wake up and think, I'm going to do one thing today, no matter how small, to improve my finances in some way. But what I want you also to do is a default. If you can't physically think of something you can do, then the default I want you to do is to read a money article, just one, for 2 minutes. And it could be a little bit longer if you want. And if you're thinking, well, where do I find these articles to read? Do sign up to our newsletter, moneytothemasses.com/newsletter. We'll put a link in the notes. And each week we send out a newsletter that has a link to all the big stories in money across the internet and the main newspapers in the UK, and also the stuff that we write as well. And so what it does is a one-stop shop for everything you need to know about money, really, what's happening. So that is a source. If you took that each week, got that 10 o'clock on a Sunday, we also do a roundup of all the money sections on the Sunday and all the property sections in there as well. There's links to the stories. You could go through that during the week and read one of those articles each day as a default. And the reason I say that is the default, because if you just did that and you read the articles one a day, a couple of minutes, every day for 365 days in a year, then what you would do is you would become incredibly knowledgeable about what's going on in the personal finance space. So it might be about news, it may be about all sorts of things to do with personal finance. So there'll be articles from us, for example, and maybe about budgeting and other things. So you're not committing to make change. What you're doing is becoming more knowledgeable, and obviously knowledge is power. And as you learn more, you become a more of an expert on these things and you make changes. So that is the default action I want everyone to try and do. So the reading is a default. So you're always making progress, because the problem is if you don't make progress or don't feel you are, then you'll become disillusioned. So you're making good habits. Now, what I want you to do is try and make one difference, one change a day. So it could be that you wake up and you say, right, today I'm going to make a commitment now to have one zero spend day a month. So a zero spend day is where you don't spend any money on anything. Obviously, you might have your bills go out of your account, but what I'm talking about discretionary spending at all on that day. And so that might be you and your partner. So your household would spend no money on anything for one day. That is actually probably easier than you think. For some people, it might think, God, that is going to be a difficult thing. It may be that you have to change something you do, like you might have to make your own lunch that day. But having a zero spend day and a commitment then to do that going forward is a positive. So it's not a New Year's resolution. What you're doing is going, I'm going to make a small change. I'm going to have one zero spend day if you don't have any at the moment. If you already do it, have one more than you do now. And then as you go forward, maybe next month you go, well, I'm going to do 2 zero spend days.
Yeah, it's really clever because it's not only if you find that achievable, it's repeatable as well.
Yeah, and you're building on something. So in theory, if you did that and you got to the end of the year, you would almost be getting towards half of the month where you aren't spending any money. But what you're really doing is thinking about what you're spending money on. It's not about you depriving yourself. It's just you controlling when you spend. Because I'm not saying about how much you spend.
And creating a habit where you're actually thinking more and being more present in terms of actually spending that money.
Yeah, and if you think there's other things you could do. So let's say you did that, then maybe you decide you're going to do one change a week. But maybe I think better to do one a day, so try and do something. And it may be you do repeat some of the things. So you might get up and say, do you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce my food shop, so your weekly food shop by 1%. Yeah, so you'd say, just to make the numbers easy for me, that you spend £100 in a week on food. Then you might go, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go there and I'm going to spend 1% less, or you're going to buy one item less, whatever it is. And that will, in time, reduce your food bill. So you would have done £99 this week. Next week, you might do £98. So you start to try and commit to doing the 1% differences. But what that will do is over time, it will start to cause you to make different choices. If you apply that logic, let's say you decide, I want to try and cut down on my spending what I spend on lunch. It's a positive decision, but what you're doing, you're not depriving yourself. You're just saying, I'm going to spend money, but I might spend 1% less than I was. So let's say you were spending £5 a day on lunch, which I know there are people who will be doing that. You say this week or this month, or whatever it may be, the time frames, you're going to have this commitment to end up spending maybe 5p less. And then next time, it may be another time in the future, you decide I'm going to do that again. Now, my new budget isn't £4.95, I'm going to go down to £4.90. And eventually, if you're buying any meal deals in places, you'll start having to make different choices, because you'll get to the point the amount you spend is less than what is actually available on the meal deal. So if you're at Tesco, for example, you'll soon get to the point where you're making wiser choices on what you're buying, and what you'll find, you'll probably end up with more food anyway, because you'll end up making better choices. So this is the change one thing, but kind of combined with that 1% incremental change. If you wanted to do something in terms of, let's say, your pension, if you could decide, I'm going to pay 1% more into my pension. Now, let's say under auto enrollment where people pay 5%, you might decide I'm going to pay 6% of my salary. And that's a change you're going to make. It's a small change, but it will make a huge difference compounded over time, because it's all about compounding. You might decide I want to start trying to incrementally increase the amount I put into savings. You might at the moment only pay hardly anything a month. So a 1% increase is just talking about pounds. Why not try and do something like the roundups you get on many of the budgeting apps? So there are things like Moneybox, for example, where you can use that to link up credit cards, bank accounts, that monitors your spending, looks at it, and then will save the change, and it will actually round that up into a savings account if you want. Many banks, for example, also offer that feature. So have a look at that. That's an incremental change. But what will happen is you'll find over the year, just saving those pence will start to build up. So to give you an example of where I've done this personally in my own finances, making a small improvement, I've just had an alarm go off in my phone the other day to increase the contributions on my children's junior ISAs by a set percentage. I do it every year to try and increase it. And it does mean that the amounts are going up only by a couple of pounds a month. But then next year, the alarm goes again, and each year I'm increasing it. So over time, by the time they're older, the amount that I'm putting in a month is going to be considerably so much bigger than when I started. And that impact of compounding and compounding of investment returns makes a significant difference rather than if I just left it as it was at the start. So every year I'm doing the incremental increase to what I'm saving for my children's future, because that has a massive impact in the long run. So always look for what can you do each day you wake up. What change can I make? One thing, and it's got to be small. I don't want people necessarily being too radical, because the good thing about it, you can always do something. No one's perfect. So you could decide, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a change that I'm going to make one decision today that I'm going to walk to work rather than drive. That means you're doing one less journey, which will save on petrol, reduce your petrol costs. You could decide that you're going to do that change and try and drive a little bit less each month. And so you'll reduce the cost you're spending on petrol each month incrementally, and it will start to bring down your petrol.
And what's good is some of these that we're discussing have dual benefits. So the walking instead of driving is not only a money thing, it's a health and fitness and good for your mental health to get out there and get walking. I thought of another example that I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my inbox and I'm going to unsubscribe to all of these marketing emails that, one, they clog up my inbox, but two, they make it easier for me to buy stuff that I don't necessarily need.
Yeah, I like that, because you could decide just to do one that day. So your decision would be, I've unsubscribed from this marketing email. Some sites, as we know, really do bombard you. Similarly, another idea could be you're going to review one standing order subscription or direct debit that you have. Don't do the whole thing, just decide I'm going to do one. So you'll wake up that day and think, what am I going to do? I'm going to look at one direct debit. Can I reduce that bill? Do I need that service? And then you make a decision about it. And again, like I said, if you haven't got time running out of things to do, you can always read an article as your one thing you do that day. I mean, cutting energy usage is potentially an easy one. The whole turn your thermostat down by 1 degree is meant to save you, I think it's about £50-60 a year, but you can try and use a little bit less energy in a day. So just try and knock your bill down slightly by maybe changing one light bulb into an energy efficient light bulb, maybe trying to do one less load of washing. Or, for example, with certain providers now, there are days where you get reduced, or hours where you get reduced energy costs or pricing. So you could try and do a little bit more, a small amount more, maybe it's one wash load during those hours to reduce your bill. So if you keep this idea of small incremental changes, they compound over time and they can have a huge impact. I'd love to hear other people's ideas. With debt, for example, you could decide to pay 1% more or a little bit more on your debt that you're repaying. So don't pay the minimum, pay an extra bit more. And so you could decide to do that over a period of time. So eventually you're paying more and more of your debts. And I mean, I did talk about spending, sort of cutting back on certain things, but it isn't just about denying yourself. It could be that you change your spending pattern. So it could be one of your budgets. Maybe it's eating out. You decide to spend a little bit less on eating out in a month. So you're going to move your spending budget on that particular activity, eating out, down by 1%. And you do that over time. And then, yes, it will take you a period of time, but it's small incremental changes. Then in months, possibly years, you'll get to the point where you aren't spending as much. I think you're more likely to succeed. It's been shown if you make these incremental changes. And I could probably keep going on, but you could, for example, decide today I'm going to do one thing that's going to improve my credit score. And that may be that you review something, but it could be that you aren't registered to vote at your household or something like that. So you decide that you're going to register to vote. And you might look at your credit score, you check your credit score, and then you look at everything that's on there and check that it's okay. So it's all about taking lots of repetitive actions, and over time you should make an incremental difference. And another one, which is something that links nicely to the side hustle bit I'm going to come on to, you could decide to generate 1% of your salary as an income. And you could decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to decide to generate 1% each week of my salary from some other means. And if you did that, then by the numbers, if you work it out, 52 weeks, you would have replaced 52% of your salary. That means within 2 years, theoretically, if you're able to keep these small incremental changes going, you would get to a stage where you will have replaced your entire salary, or you'd have a complementary income that was equivalent to your salary, and you have choices to change jobs or do whatever. So I just want to give people a little bit of optimism. If you do small changes over time, and you've got to think about it, 1% is a small amount. If you bring home £3,000, I'm saying that, well, maybe you've got to just try and, in the early days, just try and possibly end up generating £30 or £50. And if you've got ideas, it might be hobbies or things you can do that may be able to generate that. Over time, what you'll find is that you'll actually have periods where you quickly increase that revenue via your side hustle, whatever it might be. And I've got a thing about side hustles, obviously, because Money to Masses was in its essence, in its infancy, a side hustle for me that became what it is today. So always try and do that. Spend a bit of time, maybe it's 1% of your time or a small amount of your time. You don't have to obsess with the 1%. The point is a small amount of time that can increase over time. Then you'll find that you could spend that doing something new, and who knows, it'll make a massive difference. So it's that consistency that you need to do. Don't create a massive mountain to overcome. Just make small changes over time. And if nothing else, read a little bit more about personal finance, and then you'll improve your knowledge about the sector.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast. And Damien, you're going to be talking about the new side hustle tax rules. How do they affect people? What is this? It's been in the news a lot this week.
Yeah, so it's a story that hit the headlines, and I think on social media it really took off. And I can understand, because social media is used by a lot of people to make a side income, so like a side hustle. And I mean, I've mentioned earlier, I don't really like the term side hustle. It's really just a means of generating income. There are lots of ways to generate income. You could be a landlord, you could be employed, you could be self-employed, and obviously you could have your own business. But ways of generating income, yes, it might be side to your employed income, but it's a term that obviously became coined and seems to be something that's very popular. Talking about, I've heard people talk about side hustle porn. He was the guy who created Reddit once said it. I remember going to one of these events and he was there doing a talk, and he sort of got fed up about it because everyone's been told they should have a side hustle and can do anything. But the reality is that it is possible to do things on the side.
I think hustle in itself as a word has some negative connotations to it as well. It's kind of like something you're doing, you're sneaking around in the background and you're creeping around and getting this thing done. It's a side income. It's like, so long as your employer allows you to do stuff in your spare time, then why not?
Yeah, and they reckon that the stats suggest that, it's HR Magazine actually, suggests that nearly 50% of the UK population will have some kind of side hustle by 2025. So that's a huge number. And I mean, you've written books. I mean, that was one thing you did. It's something you love doing. You were very good at it, successful. Those of you who don't know the story, Andy ended up writing a number of books that effectively were sort of comedy kind of books, weren't they? And you made money, but also topped the Amazon charts.
Yeah, it was a very good side income at the time. I mean, these things come and go in terms of the rankings. But yeah, it created a side income that eventually overcame what I was actually earning through my employer at some time. So these things can very quickly run away with themselves, and they're definitely worth giving it a shot.
We were doing these things before it was called side hustling. I think that was the point. But the news this week came out that the likes of eBay, Deliveroo, Uber, Airbnb, Upwork, they're going to start having to report the income levels or what's been generated, as well as some other information, to HMRC from the 1st of January 2024. And so the way this was being portrayed by the media is that the taxman's after all these people at home who are trying to make some extra money in a cost of living crisis, and they're going after them, trying to tax them. Now, the reality is that isn't really what's happening. They haven't just decided to go after people. It is a bit about tax evasion, trying to stop that. But what's happened is that this whole idea is part of a joint effort with the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, so the OECD, and it allows tax authorities from different countries to be able to exchange information and try and stop tax evasion. And the new rules are focused on non-UK digital platforms, which include the likes that I've just mentioned. And they are now, if they want to operate in the UK, they'll need to report that information to HMRC. So that's things like bank account details and income. And that's now being portrayed as if they're somehow trying to stop mums. That was the typical thing, who are trying to buy and sell things on eBay and trying to tax them. But nothing has really changed, because income generated via those means was always taxable. So the summary before I get into the detail is that if you were following the rules, nothing's changed for you. If you were trying to generate income without paying the tax that was due, then yes, you're going to not like these rules and you're going to now have a problem. But this then begs the question about how are people taxed, or should they be taxed when they're generating side income via some of these platforms? Now, let's just take the example of people who are buying and selling online. Now, if you were to go and sell something on eBay and you're not selling for profit, and let's say you sell a jacket, for example, then you're not going to have to report that because, well, you've actually sold it at a loss. And they're not after people who sell one-off things. That's not the idea of it. The point is that you are allowed to sell your own possessions, and they called it chattels. So it comes under the taxation rules related to chattels. So if you only sell your own possessions and you didn't sell items that you bought to make a profit, and any single item that you sold isn't worth more than £6,000, you didn't sell it for more than £6,000, then you don't need to tell HMRC about it. And that is on an individual item basis. And so what sort of things are we talking about? That could be things like furniture, paintings, it could be things like crockery. It's your personal possessions. So as long as it's under £6,000, that's the rule, then you don't have to tell HMRC anyway. Now, if you do sell an item that isn't exempt from capital gains tax for any reason, and it's more than £6,000, then you've sold it for a profit as well, then you potentially could be liable to capital gains tax. But don't forget, you do have obviously your capital gains tax allowance. Now, most people won't be doing that. That's not the aim of this legislation or these changing rules. Where the things become blurred and what they're really after are the people who are buying and selling things on these platforms or generating an income via these platforms. So they're not just selling odd items, they are using it to generate an income to live from. And so there is a tool that exists, which we'll put a link to in the notes of this episode, that if you're unsure, it will be able to tell you whether you should be filling out a self-assessment tax return, because you could be liable to income tax on those earnings. So just to reiterate, if you are buying and selling things on eBay, for example, you're buying things, selling on for a profit, you're effectively running a business and you're generating income. That then becomes liable to income tax. And of course, there will be people who aren't declaring that, and HMRC doesn't know. Well, now going forward, they are likely to know, and therefore they're going to see there's a discrepancy maybe between things even being reported, or if there are, the amounts that are being reported. So they will therefore have the ability to go after people. So that is what's changed. So we'll put a link to that tool if there's anybody who is worried about whether they're going to fall foul of these rules, whether they are actually in fact trading on there rather than just selling one-off items. So if you're selling your own stuff, like I said, you're unlikely to fall foul of the rules. Now, if you are trading on there, or you do make an income, for example, you're doing one of the other platforms which isn't buying and selling, you're generating an income in some way, then you do have to pay income tax. But there are rules around that. You do have a personal allowance, so it's called a trading allowance. We've done a podcast on it in the past. We'll find a link, put it in the show notes for you. If you don't make more than £1,000 from your side hustle, then you won't be liable to tax.
And that's £1,000 per annum.
Yeah, so that's £1,000 per annum. But if you do make more than £1,000, let's say you've made £2,000, then the £1,000 above your trading allowance is then liable to taxation for income, and you still have your personal income tax allowance, which that can be offset against.
And so if people have started doing this recently, if they want to try and backtrack and work it out, it works on tax years, right? So it's the 6th of April to the 5th of April.
Yeah, but if you do make more, so in the example that I gave, let's say it was more than £2,000. Let's say you'd made about £3,000, £4,000 from your side hustle. There could be an instance where you wouldn't want to use a trading allowance because you might have costs, for example, that you want to offset. Whereas let's say you made £3,000, but you'd actually had costs of £2,000 to be able to generate that £3,000. You'd made something, for example. Then that difference between the cost and what you sold, you actually only made £1,000 profit. If you used the trading allowance of £1,000, then what would happen is you would have had the £3,000 minus the £1,000 allowance. That would have given £2,000 difference. You'd have been taxed on £2,000. So for people who were having costs of, in my example, £2,000, you wouldn't use a trading allowance. You'd just be taxed in the normal income tax way. You'd do the amount you'd sold for income generated minus your cost. That would give £1,000, and you'd be taxed on that. And so your tax liability would be lower. So we've got an article. I'll put it in the notes of this show that people can read all about it. But none of this is new. This has always been the case. If you haven't been declaring what you've earned, then that is the problem. That's tax evasion. You're not actually declaring what you've made via your side hustle. But as I say, you do have personal allowances. So people who are making relatively low amounts and it's a side income and they're not using their personal allowance, let's say for their job, it's not being used up, then they aren't going to be paying much tax anyway. It could actually be they won't pay any tax. So it's something that is noteworthy. I think a lot of people out there who won't realise, there'll be a lot of people actually out there who are probably sitting there thinking, oh no, there's a chance now that I might get caught out.
Perhaps potentially people who are in the higher rate of tax as well, and we're just doing this to earn a little bit of extra money. Suddenly they might be being hit for extra sort of 40% tax on their side hustle, which is a significant amount.
Yeah, and the point is, the reason that I want to also talk about it, which is links quite nicely to the beginning part of the show, and I was talking about doing side hustles or whatever you might want to call it. This isn't a reason not to do it. Nothing has changed. So if you are thinking that it's a new year, new you want to try and do something to generate some more money because you enjoy whatever it is you do, and you might have an opportunity to make some more extra money via an alternative income source, then these rules are no reason not to do that. Still do it.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. I'm going to be covering some key dates in this calendar year that people should be aware of to really help prepare themselves for what might be coming, because there's some good news coming in the next few months in terms of your money. There's also some bad news. And when I say good news, there's a few tax cuts that are coming. But of course, we know that there's potentially going to be some rises as well that will be coming. So if we start off in January, we've already had 1st of January, that's been and gone. And we've already covered some of the rule changes that have taken place for side hustles. We've also already had the energy price cap increase that's gone up to £1,928 for the average dual fuel household. Now, don't forget that energy price cap changes 4 times a year, or it's at least looked at 4 times a year by Ofgem. And so the key dates for that, and I'll cover all 4 of them now rather than going through them individually. 1st of January, and obviously it's quarterly after that. So you've got 1st of April, 1st of July, and the 1st of October. And of course, do keep in mind, whatever that energy price cap announcement is, you've always got the chance and the opportunity to see if there's any good fixed price energy deals out there.
Yeah, and during this year, we are likely to see some more competition in the energy market because energy prices at the moment are fluctuating, but they are predicted to start to come down, albeit slightly. But the predictions by Cornwall Insight, which are very accurate, to be honest, based on recent history, we do report on those very regularly. Even if it's not on the podcast, we write articles about them. So do make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, as I mentioned earlier, and we will talk about what they are during the year. And as the competition heats up, hopefully in the energy market, then you should start seeing some fixed rate deals that actually are below, to a decent level, than the energy price cap.
And we'll be updating articles and reviewing the best possible fixed price deals as they become available. Another key date, which is just past the 2nd of January, is good news for those looking for childcare for younger children. Applications open for the additional 15 hours of free childcare for qualifying parents to have children aged 2. Now, the previous rules dictated that parents could get free childcare for children aged 3 to 4. So this is the first phase of, if you remember back in spring 2023, Jeremy Hunt announced that there's going to be much more available help really for working parents of younger children to get people back into the workplace earlier. So that is happening. Well, it's just happened 2nd of January. So if you are a parent who has a young child who is aged 2 or just over, you can now start applying those extra 15 hours of free childcare. They actually only come into place in April, but the applications are now open.
You've got the full article and details on that on the Money to Masses website. Again, we'll put a link in the notes so people can find out more information.
A date which has just passed as we release this podcast, the 6th of January, the main rate of national insurance, which is charged on that amount between £12,570 and £50,270, been cut from 12% to 10%. You may remember that we mentioned it on the podcast. It was from the autumn statement. It means that the average worker who earns around £35,000 is going to save about £450 in this coming tax year. So that's a decent saving. There's nothing you need to do on that. It's just nice to know that that's come coming into place. Moving forward then, we've got a couple of announcements in February. We've got the Bank of England base rate announcement. That happens every 6 weeks. I won't cover all of them, but just to let you know that the next one that's coming up is very early February. And also we'll have some inflation figures again announced in February. If you're a commuter, bear in mind that the 3rd of March is a key date in terms of your travel. There is going to be a 4.9% increase for rail fares across England and Wales. And that's going to happen every year now going forward. It's going to be March, not January. I remember coming back to work in January thinking, oh no, the prices have gone up again. So a key date in the spring is the 6th of March. That's going to be the date that we will hear the 2024 spring budget. Again, we always do a really good summary on each of the budgets that take place. So there'll be an article on the Money to the Masses website within hours that will summarise everything that's been mentioned.
It's one hell of a day in the Money to the Masses offices when we have budget day, autumn statement day, because you have to try and work out what the changes actually mean and relay that to readers and obviously you guys, the listeners.
Let's move on to April now. There's a lot of changes that happen in April. And we've got an increase to the national living wage. We've got an article that covers all of the details about what that increase is. There's going to be expected increases to UK council tax, except for Scotland, which has been frozen. And most councils have the power to increase council tax by up to 5% without causing a referendum. So you could expect that most councils will probably take advantage of that. Obviously, we don't know what that will be. Just to give you an idea on what a 5% rise could mean, if you're in council tax band D, a 5% tax rise on the average council tax bill would mean an increase of about £100 a year, around about £8.50 a month. So maybe put that into your calendar. That could be a rise that could be coming for you. Colour TV licence, that goes up in April from £159 to £169. Again, we'll cover all of this in the article. Go and read it. One key thing that you need to be aware of in April is obviously that is the new tax year, 6th of April. So if you're someone who likes to take advantage of your ISA allowances, make sure you get in before the 6th of April to get this year's allowance. And obviously the 6th of April, it kicks in. It's the new tax year.
Yeah, well, on that, we were talking in the office about the tax quirk that's been removed. That is, well, it's to do with children and ISAs. Children can, or 16 and 17-year-olds can open a cash ISA and use their full cash ISA allowance, but at the same time have a junior ISA. Well, that's been removed from April. So it was probably a tax quirk that most people didn't know about, a loophole, as it were, but that is being removed from April. So if there are people out there that do decide they want to use that, then you need to hurry up because you've got to do it before April.
On the 6th of April, the tax cuts for the self-employed that were announced again in the autumn statement will come into force. So Class 2 tax contributions have been abolished and Class 4 contributions have been reduced from 9% to 8%. So those that are self-employed, the average self-employed worker earning £28,000 a year will probably be better off to the tune of about £350. So good news for them. That comes into place on the 6th of April. Also, keep in mind there are 2 tax-free allowances that will be changed as of the 6th of April. So the tax-free allowance on dividends will be reduced, halved to £500, and the tax-free allowance on capital gains tax, again, is halved to £3,000. That's part of an ongoing thing where it's been gradually reduced as the years go by. Let's move forward now. Again, through the summer, we'll have different announcements on base rates and also inflation. That's a given. Phase 2 of the extra hours for childcare comes into force on the 1st of September, which means that all qualifying working parents of children aged over 9 months. So if you remember earlier, we said any children aged over 2 years would get the 15 hours of free childcare. Well, phase 2 comes in on the 1st of September. So children aged over 9 months can now access the free childcare. So again, that's the government helping working parents back into work a little bit earlier if they need that support. Moving on to November. Now that's when we're going to be hearing about the autumn statement. The date isn't confirmed yet. Last year it was the 22nd November. There's murmurings that it'll be brought forward slightly this year to mid-November. So yeah, keep that in your diary because I don't know, it used to be the spring budget was the main one and then they just sort of had almost like an overflow into the autumn statement. Last couple of years there's been a lot going on in that autumn statement.
Yeah, normally it's always been an economic update, but this year I think it might take even more importance because we may have a general election this year. People are saying it's going to be the second half of the year, potentially. Well, if it is, then maybe that autumn statement will actually be effectively a budget for a new government. We don't know. So things are going to change, but this gives you an idea of when to think about things are going to happen.
And that's really the last key date of this calendar year that you need to be aware of. In December, we'll have some more announcements with regard to the Bank of England base rate, of course, and inflation as well. I just wanted to put it in the article, and I'll mention it here on the podcast. They're the key dates that everyone needs to be aware of. But of course, there are key dates in your finances that you should be aware of too, and probably mark those in the calendar as well. And so the dates I'm talking about is if you've got a mortgage renewal coming up, mark that in the calendar, but be mindful that you can actually start negotiating and actually lock in a fixed rate up to 6 months before your current deal expires. So notch that forward 6 months, whatever your date is, and start looking at your mortgage renewal, because rates are coming down. Damien does regular updates on what's happening with the Bank of England base rate. Also be mindful of various insurance renewals. So you've got your car insurance renewal, mark that in your calendar. Again, the key date for that is that there's kind of a sweet spot. If you leave it too late, you might not get the best deal. Mark it in your calendar about 20 days before it's due for renewal, up to a month before, and negotiate a new deal. Make sure as well that your existing insurances aren't marked for auto renewal. So contact your provider ahead of when it's going to happen and tell them not to auto renew. That gives you the power then to do all of the searching around that you need to do to get the best deals. And we put links in the article on how you can shop around for things like car insurance and home insurance. Keep an eye on the energy price cap. We mentioned that earlier, but there may be an opportunity for you to lock in better fixed rate energy deals. And finally, subscription renewals. Go through your subscriptions, see when they're due, and try and make yourself some savings, because even if you like your subscription, you want to keep it, there's an option for you to kind of play the game a little bit and start the process of cancelling, and you'll be surprised at what gets thrown at you.
Yeah, even online. So there's been magazine subscriptions where I've seen that if you start to go down the route of cancelling, they will be, is you sure? And then they go, do you want 50% off? And then you can normally get there without having to ring anybody. So that's one. One I'll throw in there as well is that you should check when your bonus rates come off of any savings accounts you have, because there'll be a lot of people who will now be putting money in cash because you get a good return, and a lot of the accounts have bonus rates for 1 year. You need to know when that is about to expire and then move your money, because it will drop considerably.
Yeah, good point. So that is it. We'll put a link to that article in the show notes so that you can read through those and bookmark all of those key dates.
I think that's a great piece, because there are a number of things in there that I'd forgotten about that it reminds me about that are happening going into this new year. So particularly in relation to the number of the allowances. So, I mean, that is it for this week. As ever, do leave a review. I am sending out the mugs to those people who've won mugs recently. So do bear with me, because I forgot to do it over the Christmas period. I didn't trust the post, to be honest with you. So I'll do it now, I promise. So do send in your reviews. We'll read out the best ones, and then you could potentially win, I should say, a Money to the Masses mug. Do follow us on our social channels. So that's Instagram. Join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. And in particular, do follow us on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. Every episode now goes onto the channel without video every time, because there is now a function on YouTube where all our episodes go through and you can play it like a podcast player, and therefore you can write comments and communicate with us if you wish to. But we will be now going to 2024 putting more of the episodes on as video, so you can see us delivering the show. So Andy, I think that's all that's left for us to do, really, is to say until next time.
That's it. Until next time.